And so we have our very first Constitution, not the Constitution that you and I are familiar with, not the one that we are still using to this very day, but our first Constitution were those Articles of Confederation and Perpetual Union. Now, first and foremost, thing you really need to know is that the Articles of Confederation did set up a functioning government, but it was a very, very weak government. Now, this was not by accident, but by plan. They intended the federal government to be very, very weak. Reason that a weak government was desired was to avoid some kind of strong national government that could take away our inalienable rights or abuse their power. We had, as a nation, survived the tyranny of Britain. And as such, we wanted to make sure that that mistake was not to be repeated. We wanted to leave the power with the states instead of with the national government to ensure that that national government would never have the ability to turn against us. If the states were strong, the theory went, then we would be able to protect ourselves then and far into the future. Drawback was that while this did work, we did have a weak national government, it didn't work out nearly the way people had hoped. Now, the Articles had no executive branch. Okay, there was no president. You didn't have a single leader. And again, this was by design. They did not want to have one single person in charge of the country out of the fear that that one individual would seize power and would hold onto it basically forever. They did not want to see a dictator of some kind come to power and take over within the United States. So there was no executive branch. There was no president or single leader. We did have a weak Congress. That Congress, each state could send between 2 to 7 delegates. And when there, each state got one vote. It did not matter if you were the largest state population-wise in the Union or if you were the smallest state. You each got one vote. And if you only wanted to send 2 delegates, great. If you wanted to send 7, great. It didn't matter because you only got the one vote. Plus, it required a 2/3 or what's known as a supermajority on any subject of importance. If you wanted to go through and actually change the Articles of Confederation, that could be done, but unfortunately, it would take a unanimous vote by all the states in the Union. And in all honesty, that was never going to happen. 9 times out of 10, it would be Rhode Island would vote no, even though 12 other states voted yes, simply because they wanted to prove they were every bit as strong and as important as everybody else. We also had no national court system. Each law passed by the Congress was interpreted as each state saw fit. And probably one of the biggest weaknesses they had, they could not tax. They could only ask for money from the states. Congress was weak. It could not regulate commerce in addition to not being able to collect taxes. In other words, today we have what's called the Interstate Commerce Clause within the Constitution. There was nothing similar to that in the Articles of Confederation. Each state did as it saw fit in trading with other states, in charging what it wanted to trade. As we said, each state printed their own worthless paper money. And Congress could do nothing about it. The states could create whatever they wanted to create. And if they wanted to go through and they wanted to, just keep printing, dollar after dollar after dollar, they could absolutely do that. But it also meant that each successive dollar was worth less and less and less. So you would, as I said, have to exchange your money from New Jersey to New York. You had to get rid of your New Jersey dollars for New York dollars or something along those lines. The idea behind this was, again, to keep the states strong, to keep the states to be the one that actually held all of the power in this government. States competed with one another for foreign trade. Okay, the federal government today is in charge of international trade. Okay, they have the final say on these things. But back then, there was no court system. There was no executive branch. And so each state did what it wanted. And if that meant, cutting the legs out from under another state, so be it. It didn't bother them to go through and essentially, just undercut one another if it meant they were going to get a better deal for themselves. Human nature is what human nature is. Now, let's say there was some kind of an emergency. Let's say that there was a problem that Congress needed to deal with, militarily speaking. They could not call upon soldiers. They could not order them. They could ask for them, basically. They could call up soldiers from the states, and they weren't going to really necessarily do anything. Now, for example, there was a problem, 1783. You had a group of Pennsylvania soldiers. They began to harass the federal government in Philadelphia. They were demanding their back pay. Now, they are like many of us, that if you go through and you have a job somewhere, you want to get paid. And if you have done the work, you anticipate getting paid. Well, the soldiers had done the job, but had yet to be paid, and they wanted their money. When the government pleaded for help from the state, they didn't receive any. Basically, what they had to do was pack up and move to another state. So the national or the federal government could not control what was going on around it. If there was a problem, they could ask for help from the states, but they would be unable to actually, do anything about it. They could pack up and move, and that was about their one move. However, the government under the Articles was a model of what a loose confederation should be. Literally, while it doesn't look like it was a good government, it was the perfect example of a loose confederation. They really did that well. And what's more, this was a huge stepping stone toward the actual creation of the U.S. Constitution. It would be the issues, the problems, and all these other things that were going on under the Articles of Confederation that would convince people that something had to be done. While this was a great example of a loose confederation, a lot of people began to think that the states were wielding an alarmingly great amount of power, that they had a lot of authority, and that they were able to do whatever they wanted, despite what was in the best interest of the nation. And there were those who started to get concerned. There were those who were afraid that the system under which we were now operating was not the best system possible. And they were ready to make some changes.